What if some of the strangest parts of your mind are things you experience every single day without ever noticing them? Tonight, we're exploring 100 unusual psychology facts that reveal how perception, memory, attention, emotion, and decision-making quietly shape everyday life. Along the way, you'll discover why certain songs become impossible to forget, why embarrassing moments can stay vivid for years, why harmless situations sometimes trigger powerful fears, and why the passage of time can feel completely different from one moment to the next. Many of these facts seem surprising at first because they challenge common assumptions about how the mind works. Others reveal hidden patterns operating beneath ordinary experiences, influencing what we notice, what we remember, and what we believe. If you enjoy thoughtful explorations of science, psychology, and the mysteries of human behavior, consider subscribing to Calm Science Lab so you won't miss future journeys like this one. And with that, we'll begin with a question almost everyone has asked at some point. Why do familiar songs linger endlessly inside the mind? 1. Why familiar songs linger endlessly inside the mind? There is a curious experience that almost everyone encounters sooner or later. A song appears in the mind without invitation. Perhaps it is a melody heard earlier in the day while walking through a grocery store. Perhaps it is a tune from childhood that has not been heard in years. Sometimes it arrives as a complete chorus. Sometimes only a small fragment repeats again and again. The music continues quietly in the background of thought, lingering long after the actual sound has disappeared. Psychologists often refer to this phenomenon as involuntary musical imagery. In everyday language, many people simply call it a song stuck in the head. Although it can feel strange, it is remarkably common. Research suggests that most people experience it regularly, regardless of age, personality, or musical ability. The question is not why this happens occasionally. The more interesting question is why familiar songs seem especially powerful. Why do certain melodies remain active in the mind while thousands of others fade almost immediately? Part of the answer begins with the way the human brain processes patterns. The brain is often described as an organ that predicts the future. At every moment, it attempts to anticipate what will happen next. This process helps people move efficiently through the world. It allows a person to finish familiar sentences before they are completed. It helps recognize faces after only a brief glance. It allows experienced drivers to anticipate traffic movements before they fully unfold. Music is particularly suited to this predictive machinery. A melody is not a random collection of sounds. It contains structure. Notes create expectations. Rhythms establish patterns. Chord progressions suggest likely destinations. As a song unfolds, the brain continuously predicts what note, beat, or phrase will come next. When predictions are confirmed, listeners experience a subtle sense of satisfaction. The brain enjoys discovering order. Familiar songs become powerful because their patterns are already deeply learned. The mind knows what comes next before it arrives. In a sense, listening to a familiar song is not simply hearing music. It is participating in a prediction game that the brain has already mastered. This may explain why familiar melodies often return uninvited. The neural pathways connected to those musical patterns have been strengthened through repeated exposure. The brain can activate them with very little effort. An interesting detail emerges when researchers examine which parts of songs become stuck most often. It is usually not an entire composition. More commonly, a short section repeats, a chorus, a hook, a memorable phrase. These sections often share certain characteristics. They are simple enough to remember easily, yet distinctive enough to stand apart from surrounding material. They create a balance between predictability and novelty. The brain appears particularly sensitive to this balance. If a melody is completely predictable, it becomes boring. If it is completely unpredictable, it becomes difficult to remember. The songs that linger tend to occupy a middle ground. They offer enough familiarity to feel comfortable and enough variation to remain interesting. This principle appears throughout human psychology. People often prefer experiences that are neither too simple nor too complex. Stories, conversations, visual designs, and musical compositions frequently become most engaging when they strike this delicate equilibrium. Songs that remain in memory may therefore represent an unusually successful match between musical structure and cognitive preference. Memory itself also plays a significant role. Human memory is not a storage room filled with perfect recordings. It is an active system that constantly reconstructs information. Memories are strengthened when they connect to existing networks of knowledge and emotion. A familiar song rarely exists in isolation. A particular melody may be connected to a summer vacation decades earlier. Another may evoke a school dance, a long road trip, or a certain apartment once occupied. Even when listeners are not consciously thinking about these associations, the connections remain embedded within memory. When one element of the network becomes activated, related elements may follow. Hearing a brief fragment of a song can awaken memories of places, people, emotions, and experiences. Likewise, encountering a familiar location or emotional state can activate the song itself. The result is a remarkably interconnected system. Music becomes woven into the fabric of personal history. Scientists studying memory often describe retrieval as a process of association. One thought leads naturally to another. A smell triggers a forgotten memory. A photograph recalls an entire afternoon. A melody unlocks experiences that seemed long buried. Because songs are rich in emotional and contextual associations, they possess an unusual ability to travel through these mental pathways. This connection between music and memory becomes especially striking in older adulthood. Researchers have observed that songs learned during adolescence and early adulthood often retain extraordinary power throughout life. Even individuals experiencing significant memory decline may remember lyrics, melodies, and musical details from decades earlier. The reasons are still being explored, but one possibility involves timing. During adolescence, many experiences feel especially significant. Personal identity is forming, social relationships become increasingly important. Emotional experiences often carry exceptional intensity. Music frequently serves as a soundtrack during this period. As a result, songs heard during those years may become deeply integrated into autobiographical memory. They are not simply pieces of music. They become markers of identity and personal history. This may help explain why certain songs seem immortal within the mind. They are connected not merely to sound, but to entire chapters of life. Another fascinating factor involves what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, a tendency for incomplete mental tasks to remain active in awareness. The human mind often dislikes unfinished patterns. An unanswered question can linger for hours. An unresolved problem may return repeatedly during unrelated activities. Some researchers believe a similar process contributes to musical persistence. When only part of a song is remembered or heard, the brain may continue attempting to complete the pattern. The unfinished sequence remains active, creating the sensation that the melody is replaying itself internally. In this way, the lingering song may represent the mind's quiet effort to resolve something that feels incomplete. A process that becomes even more intriguing when attention itself enters the picture. 2. How invisible choices quietly shape everyday decisions. Every day, people make countless decisions without noticing most of them. Some choices feel obvious and deliberate. Selecting a route to work, deciding what to eat for dinner, or choosing a movie to watch can seem like conscious acts of judgment. Yet beneath these visible decisions exists a much larger landscape of invisible choices, small mental selections that occur so quietly they rarely enter awareness. Psychologists have long been fascinated by this hidden layer of decision-making because it challenges a common assumption about human behavior. Many people imagine themselves moving through life as active decision-makers, carefully weighing options and arriving at conclusions through conscious reasoning. While conscious thought certainly plays an important role, research repeatedly suggests that much of everyday behavior is shaped before deliberate reasoning even begins. Consider a simple walk through a supermarket. A shopper enters intending to purchase only a few items. Along the way, countless decisions unfold. Which aisle seems most inviting? Which package attracts attention first? Which product appears trustworthy? Which item feels familiar? Which price seems reasonable? Many of these judgments occur within fractions of a second. The shopper may later explain the purchase using logical reasons, yet psychologists often find that subtle environmental influences were already guiding attention and preference long before conscious explanation appeared. One reason this happens is that attention itself is selective. The human brain receives an extraordinary amount of information every moment. Colors, sounds, textures, movements, faces, words, temperatures, smells, and countless other signals compete for processing. It would be impossible to examine all of them equally. As a result, the mind constantly makes invisible choices about what deserves attention and what can safely remain in the background. Most people experience this without realizing it. A person may enter a crowded room and immediately notice someone smiling while overlooking dozens of neutral faces. Another may hear a familiar name spoken across a noisy space, despite ignoring hundreds of surrounding conversations. These moments reveal something important. Before decisions about action occur, decisions about attention have already been made, and attention often determines what becomes possible to choose. If an option never reaches awareness, it cannot be seriously considered. The invisible choice of where attention lands may therefore influence every visible decision that follows. This process becomes even more interesting when familiarity enters the picture. Humans generally prefer things they recognize. Psychologists sometimes call this the mere exposure effect. Repeated exposure to a person, object, word, or symbol often increases liking, even when individuals are unaware of the repeated encounters. A face seen many times may gradually feel trustworthy. A product viewed repeatedly may seem more appealing. A song heard frequently may become enjoyable even if it initially attracted little interest. What makes this phenomenon remarkable is that the preference often emerges without conscious intention. The mind quietly interprets familiarity as a sign of safety or reliability. Unknown things require caution. Familiar things feel easier to process. This subtle preference influences choices constantly. When selecting among similar options, people often gravitate toward what feels easiest to recognize. The decision appears voluntary, yet invisible experiences from previous days, weeks, or even years may already have tilted the scales. Memory contributes another hidden influence. When people evaluate situations, they rarely search every relevant memory equally. Instead, certain memories become easier to retrieve than others. Events that were recent, emotional, surprising, or vivid tend to come to mind more quickly. Imagine someone deciding whether air travel is dangerous. If they recently watched news coverage of a dramatic aviation incident, examples of airplane accidents may appear immediately in memory. Because these examples are easy to recall, the risk may feel larger than it actually is. Meanwhile, the countless safe flights occurring every day remain largely invisible because they leave weaker memory traces. Psychologists refer to this tendency as the availability heuristic. Rather than calculating probabilities directly, people often rely on how easily examples come to mind. The result is a decision shaped by memory accessibility rather than objective frequency. Yet, from the individual's perspective, the judgment feels perfectly reasonable. Invisible choices are also influenced by timing. A growing body of research suggests that small contextual differences can alter decisions in surprising ways. Fatigue, hunger, temperature, lighting, and mental workload may all shift preferences without obvious awareness. A person evaluating options after a long day may reach different conclusions than they would in the morning. Complex decisions often become simplified when mental resources are depleted. Familiar choices become more attractive. New possibilities receive less consideration. This does not mean people lose control of their decisions. Rather, it highlights how decision-making operates within a constantly changing psychological environment. The mind is never functioning in isolation from its circumstances. Even language can quietly guide choices. The way a question is framed often changes how people respond. Describing a medical treatment as having a 90% survival rate tends to create different reactions than describing it as having a 10% mortality rate. despite both statements conveying identical information. The facts remain unchanged. What changes is the mental frame surrounding those facts. Human cognition is highly sensitive to framing because meaning depends not only on information itself, but also on context. The brain continuously interprets signals relative to expectations, comparisons, and surrounding cues. As a result, small differences in wording can produce surprisingly large differences in judgment. Social influences add another layer to this hidden architecture. People often imagine themselves as independent thinkers, yet humans evolved within groups. For most of history, survival depended heavily upon social connection. Sensitivity to the behavior of others became deeply embedded within psychological systems. Because of this, individuals frequently look to others when deciding how to behave, even when they are unaware of doing so. If a restaurant appears crowded, potential customers may assume the food is good. If many people adopt a particular habit, others may view that behavior as normal. If an idea appears widely accepted, it can seem more credible. These signals often operate beneath conscious reflection. The mind uses social information as a shortcut, reducing uncertainty in complex environments. What emerges from all of these findings is a picture of decision-making that is both humbling and fascinating. Visible choices rarely arise from a single moment of conscious thought. They emerge from layers of attention, memory, familiarity, context, framing, emotion, and social influence, all interacting beneath awareness. The final decision may feel simple: choosing one product instead of another, taking one route home rather than a different route, trusting one person more than someone else. Yet beneath that seemingly ordinary moment lies an intricate network of invisible selections quietly shaping the outcome. And among the most influential of these hidden forces are the mental shortcuts that help people navigate a world far too complex to analyze in full detail. A subject that leads naturally toward some of psychology's strangest and most revealing discoveries. 3. Strange reasons people remember embarrassing moments more vividly. Few experiences linger in memory quite like embarrassment. A person may forget hundreds of ordinary conversations, countless routine errands, and entire weeks that passed without anything unusual occurring. Yet a single awkward moment from years earlier can remain remarkably vivid: a mispronounced word during a presentation, a social mistake at a party, an accidental fall in a public place, a comment that sounded perfectly reasonable before it left the mouth and immediately felt wrong afterward. What makes these memories especially curious is that they often return unexpectedly. Someone might be washing dishes, driving along a familiar road, or sitting quietly in a waiting room when an incident from 10 or 20 years ago suddenly appears in consciousness. The emotional intensity may be far weaker than it was originally, yet the memory itself often feels unusually clear. Psychologists have spent decades studying why certain moments become so durable. The answer reveals several fascinating features of how human memory operates. One reason involves the relationship between emotion and attention. The human brain does not treat every experience equally. Most daily events receive relatively limited processing because they contain little information that appears important for future survival or learning. The brain is constantly deciding which experiences deserve long-term storage and which can safely fade. Emotion serves as one of the most powerful signals in this sorting process. When something triggers a strong emotional reaction, the brain often interprets the event as significant. Increased attention is directed toward details of the experience. Sensory information may be processed more deeply. Memory systems become more active. Embarrassment, despite seeming mild compared to fear or danger, can produce surprisingly strong emotional activation. Humans are intensely social creatures. Throughout much of evolutionary history, maintaining positive relationships within a group was critically important. Acceptance brought cooperation, protection, and access to resources. Rejection could carry substantial consequences. Because social standing mattered, the brain evolved systems that monitor social mistakes carefully. An embarrassing moment may therefore receive enhanced processing, not because it threatens physical safety, but because it appears relevant to social survival. The brain responds as though it has discovered valuable information. Something happened. It felt uncomfortable. It should be remembered so similar mistakes can potentially be avoided in the future. This process helps explain why embarrassing memories often feel more vivid than neutral experiences occurring on the same day. The emotional significance acted like a marker, telling the memory system that this particular event deserved special attention. Yet emotional intensity alone does not fully explain the phenomenon. Another factor involves what psychologists sometimes call self-relevance. People tend to remember information that relates directly to themselves more effectively than information concerning strangers. A random person's mistake may be forgotten quickly. One's own mistake can remain memorable for decades. This difference reflects the unique role of the self in human cognition. The mind continuously organizes experiences around personal identity. Information connected to the self becomes integrated into a rich network of memories, beliefs, goals, and social experiences. Embarrassing events often connect directly to concerns about competence, appearance, intelligence, or social acceptance. As a result, they become deeply linked to existing self-related memory structures. The stronger these connections become, the easier the memory is to retrieve later. Interestingly, the vividness of embarrassing memories may not always reflect their actual importance. A psychological phenomenon known as the spotlight effect helps explain why. Researchers have repeatedly found that people tend to overestimate how much others notice their mistakes. Imagine someone spilling a drink during a gathering. From their perspective, the event feels highly visible. Attention immediately focuses on the mistake. Self-consciousness increases. The moment appears enormous. Meanwhile, everyone else may be occupied with their own thoughts, conversations, and concerns. Many observers notice the incident briefly and then move on almost immediately. Yet the individual who made the mistake often carries the memory forward for years. This occurs because people experience the world from the center of their own perspective. Personal mistakes receive intense internal attention. Other people's mistakes usually receive much less. As a result, embarrassing events often feel more socially significant than they actually were. The brain stores the memory as though a major social incident occurred, even when most witnesses barely remember it. This mismatch between perception and reality creates one of the strangest aspects of embarrassment. Many memories that continue generating discomfort are remembered vividly by only one person. Everyone else has often forgotten them entirely. Memory reconstruction also plays a surprisingly important role. Contrary to popular belief, remembering is not simply replaying a stored recording. Each act of recall involves reconstruction. The brain rebuilds the memory using available information, emotions, beliefs, and expectations. This means memories can subtly change over time. An embarrassing event recalled repeatedly may become increasingly polished. Certain details grow sharper, others disappear. The emotional meaning attached to the event may strengthen. In some cases, people unintentionally exaggerate the importance of the original incident simply through repeated reflection. The memory becomes familiar not because the event was extraordinarily significant, but because it has been revisited many times. Each retrieval strengthens pathways associated with the experience. The event acquires a larger presence within memory than its objective importance might justify. Psychologists sometimes refer to this process as rehearsal. The more frequently a memory is mentally reviewed, the easier it becomes to access in the future. Embarrassing moments are particularly vulnerable to this cycle because they naturally attract reflection. People often analyze what happened. They imagine alternative outcomes. They wonder how others interpreted the situation. They replay conversations and search for different responses that might have worked better. Each review increases familiarity, and familiarity itself enhances accessibility. Eventually, the memory becomes one of the easiest experiences for the brain to retrieve. Another intriguing factor involves prediction error. The brain constantly generates expectations about how events should unfold. Most experiences follow these predictions reasonably well. Embarrassing moments often violate them dramatically. A person expects to walk confidently across a room and suddenly trips. Someone expects a joke to be well received and encounters silence. A speaker expects to remember a prepared line and unexpectedly forgets it. These moments create a mismatch between expectation and reality. The brain pays close attention to such mismatches because they contain potentially valuable information. Unexpected outcomes signal opportunities for learning. As a result, experiences involving surprise frequently become more memorable than routine events. Embarrassment combines surprise with emotional significance, creating a particularly effective recipe for long-term memory formation. Perhaps the strangest aspect of all is that many embarrassing memories eventually lose their original meaning. Years later, people often look back on incidents that once felt devastating and find them surprisingly ordinary. The social catastrophe that seemed enormous at age 16 may appear almost charming at age 40. The memory remains vivid, but its emotional interpretation changes. This shift reveals something important about human memory. What persists is not simply the event itself, but an evolving relationship between the event and the person remembering it. And as memories continue to transform through time, they connect naturally to another psychological mystery: why the mind can sometimes create recollections that feel completely accurate, even when parts of them were never true in the first place. 4. Why faces appear meaningful within random visual patterns. There is a peculiar experience that occurs across cultures, ages, and historical periods. A person looks at the front of a car and suddenly notices a smiling expression. Another gazes at clouds drifting across the sky and sees a human face emerging from the shifting shapes. A piece of toast appears to contain familiar features. Shadows on a wall seem to resemble eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Once the face is noticed, it often becomes difficult to unsee. What makes this phenomenon especially intriguing is that the object itself was never designed to be a face. The arrangement may be completely accidental, yet the perception feels immediate and convincing. Psychologists refer to this tendency as pareidolia, the experience of perceiving meaningful patterns within random or ambiguous information. Although pareidolia can involve many kinds of patterns, faces are by far the most common and powerful examples. The question is why? Why does the human brain repeatedly discover faces in places where no faces actually exist? The answer begins with the remarkable importance of facial recognition in human life. From the earliest moments after birth, human beings display an unusual sensitivity to face-like arrangements. Infants pay attention to patterns resembling eyes and mouths long before they understand language or social rules. This early preference reflects something fundamental about human development. Faces contain extraordinarily valuable information. A face can reveal identity, emotion, attention, intention, age, health, and countless subtle social signals. Long before written language existed, faces provided essential information for navigating relationships and understanding the behavior of others. For social creatures, recognizing faces quickly became a significant evolutionary advantage. Missing an important facial signal could carry costs. Detecting one unnecessarily carried relatively little risk. Imagine two ancient individuals moving through a complex environment. One brain occasionally mistakes a shadow for a face. The other frequently overlooks actual faces hidden among visual clutter. The first individual may experience occasional false alarms. The second risks missing important social information entirely. Over thousands of generations, natural selection tends to favor systems that avoid costly misses, even if they occasionally produce harmless mistakes. As a result, the human visual system appears biased toward detecting faces whenever evidence is even moderately suggestive. The brain would rather mistakenly identify a face where none exists than fail to notice one that is genuinely present. This principle helps explain why face perception often seems almost automatic. People do not usually search consciously for faces within clouds or patterns on walls. The recognition occurs rapidly and effortlessly. The brain performs the analysis before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. Modern brain imaging studies reveal that specific regions of the brain are highly responsive to faces. One particularly well-known area, often called the fusiform face area, becomes strongly active when people view facial features. What is fascinating is that these regions may respond not only to real faces, but also to objects that merely resemble faces. A pair of circular shapes positioned above a horizontal line may be enough to trigger facial processing systems. The actual object could be an electrical outlet, a building facade, or a collection of rocks. Yet certain arrangements reliably activate the perception of a face. This sensitivity demonstrates how little information is sometimes required. The human brain is extraordinarily skilled at extracting meaning from incomplete data. In daily life, this ability provides substantial advantages. People rarely view faces under perfect conditions. Lighting changes constantly. Objects partially block visibility. Faces appear at different angles and distances. Expressions shift from moment to moment. If facial recognition required complete information, social interaction would become far more difficult. Instead, the brain excels at filling gaps. Given a few suggestive features, it rapidly constructs a coherent interpretation. Most of the time, this strategy works remarkably well. Occasionally, however, the same mechanism generates faces where none exist. The phenomenon reveals something broader about perception itself. Many people imagine perception as a passive process. The world provides information, and the brain records it. Yet psychological research increasingly suggests a different picture. Perception is highly active. The brain does not merely receive information. It continuously interprets, predicts, and organizes incoming signals. Vision is not simply seeing what exists. It is constructing a useful model of reality based on available evidence. This construction process becomes especially apparent when information is incomplete or ambiguous. A cloud contains no objective face. Nevertheless, the visual system searches for familiar structures. It compares patterns against stored templates acquired through years of experience. When a rough match appears, a face emerges within perception. In a sense, the observer contributes to what is being seen. The face exists not in the cloud itself, but in the interaction between the cloud and the brain interpreting it. This tendency extends far beyond visual illusions. Human beings constantly search for meaning in complex environments. Patterns provide a sense of understanding. They help transform uncertainty into something more manageable. Faces represent one particularly powerful example because they are among the most familiar patterns humans encounter. Every day, people spend enormous amounts of time observing faces. Thousands upon thousands of examples accumulate across a lifetime. The brain becomes exceptionally efficient at recognizing them. As a result, even weak visual hints may activate deeply learned recognition systems. Interestingly, emotional state can influence this process as well. Studies suggest that people may become more likely to perceive meaningful patterns under certain psychological conditions. Loneliness, uncertainty, heightened vigilance, or emotional arousal can sometimes increase sensitivity to social cues. This makes intuitive sense. When social information feels especially important, the brain may lower the threshold for detecting it. A face-like pattern that might normally be ignored suddenly becomes noticeable. The same principle appears in other domains of perception. Individuals expecting danger often become more attentive to potential threats. People searching for a friend in a crowd become more likely to interpret ambiguous figures as familiar. Expectations shape perception. The brain is not simply asking what is present. It is also asking what might be present. Another curious feature of pareidolia involves emotional response. Faces discovered in random objects frequently seem expressive. A building may appear cheerful, a backpack may seem worried, a tree knot may look surprised. Objectively, none of these emotions exist, yet the perception often feels immediate and natural. This occurs because facial recognition and emotion recognition are closely linked systems. Human beings evolved not only to identify faces but also to interpret what those faces might be communicating. Consequently, once a face-like pattern is detected, emotional interpretation often follows automatically. The object acquires a personality despite possessing none. This tendency reveals how deeply social cognition permeates human perception. Even inanimate objects can become temporary participants in the social world when arranged in the right visual configuration. Perhaps the most fascinating lesson of all is what pareidolia teaches about certainty. When people see a face in a cloud, They are not hallucinating in the clinical sense. They are experiencing the normal operation of a brain designed to find meaningful structure in a complicated world. The perception feels real because it is generated by systems that are usually highly reliable. Yet the phenomenon also serves as a reminder that perception is never a perfect mirror of reality. The mind constantly interprets, predicts, fills gaps, and constructs patterns. Most of the time, these constructions help people navigate their surroundings effectively. Occasionally, they create compelling illusions, and among the most influential forces guiding those interpretations are the expectations carried into every experience, subtle assumptions that quietly shape not only what people think they see, but what they believe they notice in the first place. 5. The surprising psychology behind losing objects in plain sight. Almost everyone has experienced the same peculiar moment. A person searches for a missing item with growing determination. The object seems to have vanished completely. Keys are nowhere to be found. A phone appears lost. A pair of glasses has disappeared. The search expands from one room to another. Drawers are opened. Cushions are lifted. Surfaces are examined repeatedly. Then, after several frustrating minutes, the missing object is discovered in a location that had apparently been checked already. Sometimes it is sitting openly on a table. Sometimes it occupies the center of a desk. Sometimes it is positioned exactly where one would logically expect it to be. The immediate reaction is often disbelief. How could something so visible remain unnoticed? The answer reveals several surprising truths about the nature of attention, perception, and memory. Far from being a simple failure of eyesight, losing objects in plain sight often reflects the way the brain efficiently manages information. To understand why this happens, it helps to begin with a misconception about vision. Many people assume they see everything directly in front of them. The experience of looking around a room certainly creates that impression. The visual world appears rich, detailed, and continuous. Yet psychological research suggests that this feeling is somewhat deceptive. The brain processes enormous amounts of visual information, but attention remains limited. At any given moment, only a small portion of the environment receives detailed examination. Most of what appears to be complete visual awareness is actually a combination of selective attention, prediction, and reconstruction. The mind creates a convincing sense of seeing everything, while carefully allocating resources to only what seems important. This strategy is remarkably effective most of the time. Without it, daily life would become overwhelming. Every object, texture, color, and movement would compete equally for attention. The brain would struggle to identify what matters. Instead, attention acts like a spotlight. It illuminates certain features while leaving others in relative darkness. When searching for a missing object, this spotlight can sometimes become surprisingly narrow. Imagine someone searching for a set of keys. A mental image forms almost immediately. The keys are expected to appear in a particular orientation, location, or context. The search begins with these expectations already in place. The brain starts looking not simply for keys, but for a specific version of keys. If the real object differs from that expectation, it may be overlooked. Perhaps the keys are partially covered by a piece of paper. Perhaps they are positioned vertically rather than horizontally. Perhaps unusual lighting changes their appearance. Although the keys remain visible, they fail to match the anticipated pattern. The eyes may pass over them repeatedly without conscious recognition. This phenomenon highlights an important principle of perception. People do not merely see objects. They interpret visual information according to expectations. In many situations, expectations improve efficiency. They help identify familiar objects rapidly and reduce cognitive effort. Yet occasionally the same process creates blind spots. The object is present. The visual information reaches the eyes, but attention does not fully register its significance. Psychologists sometimes study related phenomena using experiments involving inattentional blindness. In these studies, participants focus intensely on a specific task. While concentrating, they often fail to notice highly visible events occurring directly before them. One famous example involves observers counting passes between basketball players. During the task, a person wearing a gorilla suit walks through the scene. Remarkably, many participants fail to notice the gorilla entirely. The result seems impossible until one understands the role of attention. The eyes received the information. The brain simply prioritized something else. The same principle can contribute to everyday object searches. When attention becomes locked onto certain possibilities, other information receives less processing. The missing item may exist within the visual field yet remain outside the focus of awareness. Memory introduces another layer of complexity. Many people assume they remember exactly where they placed an object. Yet memory for routine actions is often surprisingly fragile. Consider the simple act of setting down a phone. If the action occurs while attention is divided, perhaps during a conversation, while thinking about work, or while preparing to leave the house, the memory may never become strongly encoded. The object was placed somewhere. The action occurred successfully, but little detailed memory was created. Later, when attempting to recall the event, the brain reconstructs a likely scenario rather than retrieving a perfect record. People often search locations where the object is usually placed because those memories are more accessible. Meanwhile, the actual location receives less attention because it falls outside established routines. In this sense, the object is not truly lost. The memory of placing it is what has disappeared. Habits also play an unexpectedly powerful role. Human behavior contains countless routines performed with minimal conscious awareness. Walking through familiar rooms, setting down belongings, opening doors, and organizing personal items often occur automatically. Automation saves mental energy. However, it can also create moments where actions happen without strong conscious monitoring. A person intending to place keys in one location may absent-mindedly place them elsewhere while thinking about an unrelated problem. The behavior occurs successfully, but awareness remains focused somewhere else. Hours later, the unusual placement feels mysterious because the decision was never consciously noted. The mind assumes the keys should be where they normally belong. The actual location remains hidden behind habit-driven expectations. Stress can amplify these difficulties considerably. When people become anxious about finding a missing object, attention often narrows further. This narrowing evolved for practical reasons. Under pressure, focusing intensely on immediate goals can improve performance. Yet in certain situations it becomes counterproductive. An anxious searcher may repeatedly examine the same locations while overlooking obvious alternatives. The growing frustration strengthens existing assumptions rather than encouraging broader exploration. Ironically, many people discover missing items shortly after giving up. This pattern appears so frequently that it feels almost magical. In reality, the explanation may involve attention. Once active searching stops, mental tension decreases. Expectations relax. Attention broadens. Previously ignored information becomes easier to notice. The object that seemed invisible suddenly appears. Nothing changed about the object itself. What changed was the way the brain was processing the environment. Another fascinating factor involves familiarity. Objects that remain constantly present often receive less attention over time. The brain becomes accustomed to them. Familiar items blend into the background of perception. When a missing object occupies a visually familiar location, it may paradoxically become harder to notice. Attention glides over the area because nothing appears unusual. The object effectively hides within normality. This reflects a broader characteristic of human cognition. The brain is often more interested in change than stability. Unexpected movement captures attention immediately. New information receives priority. Familiar scenes receive less scrutiny. As a result, an object resting quietly where it has always been may become surprisingly easy to overlook. Taken together, these findings reveal something profound about perception. Losing objects in plain sight is not simply carelessness. It emerges from systems that usually serve people exceptionally well. Attention filters information efficiently. Memory conserves resources. Expectations accelerate recognition. Habits reduce mental workload. The same mechanisms that make everyday life manageable occasionally produce small moments of mystery. A phone disappears while sitting on a counter. Glasses hide while resting on a table. Keys seem to vanish despite remaining in the same room all along. These experiences remind us that seeing is not merely looking. Remembering is not merely storing information. Awareness itself is an active process shaped by attention, expectation, and interpretation, and nowhere is that influence more apparent than in the subtle expectations that quietly alter what people experience, even when the external world remains exactly the same. 6. How expectations subtly change what people actually experience. Human beings often imagine experience as something that simply happens to them. Light enters the eyes, sound reaches the ears, information arrives from the outside world, and the brain records it. From this perspective, perception resembles a camera documenting reality as accurately as possible. Yet modern psychology paints a more complicated picture. The brain is not merely receiving information, it is constantly predicting what information is likely to arrive next. Expectations flow ahead of perception, quietly shaping how incoming signals are interpreted. In many situations, what people experience depends not only on what is present in the environment, but also on what the mind anticipated finding there. This influence is often subtle. Most people do not wake up and consciously decide to alter their perception of reality. The process unfolds automatically, beneath awareness, woven into the ordinary operation of the brain. One of the simplest demonstrations involves taste. Imagine two identical drinks poured into different containers. One is presented in elegant packaging, the other appears plain and inexpensive. Even when the liquid is exactly the same, people frequently report different experiences. The drink associated with higher quality may seem richer, smoother, or more enjoyable. The cheaper-looking version may receive less favorable descriptions. What changed was not the beverage itself. What changed was the expectation surrounding it. The brain incorporated prior beliefs into the experience. This phenomenon appears repeatedly across many areas of life. Expectations do not merely influence judgments after an experience occurs. They can alter the experience itself. To understand why, it helps to consider the enormous challenge facing the human brain. At every moment, sensory systems deliver vast amounts of information. Visual details alone are staggering. Colors, shadows, movement, depth, texture, and countless other signals arrive continuously. If the brain attempted to analyze every piece of information from scratch, perception would become inefficient and slow. Instead, the mind relies heavily on prediction. Based on past experiences, it generates expectations about what is likely to happen. Incoming information is then compared against these predictions. When expectations match reality reasonably well, perception becomes faster and more efficient. Most of the time, this system works remarkably well. The person walking through a familiar neighborhood already possesses expectations about roads, buildings, signs, and common sounds. These predictions help organize perception and reduce uncertainty. Without them, everyday environments would feel chaotic. Yet prediction comes with an interesting consequence. Because expectations contribute to perception, they can sometimes shape what people actually experience. Consider a familiar social situation. Someone introduces two strangers. One is described as warm and friendly. The other is described as distant and difficult. Before either person speaks a single word, expectations have already been established. The same behavior may now be interpreted differently depending on those expectations. A brief pause in conversation might seem thoughtful in one individual and unfriendly in another. A quiet personality may appear calm or aloof, depending on the mental framework already in place. The actual behavior remains unchanged. The interpretation shifts. What is particularly fascinating is that these interpretations often feel completely natural. People rarely notice the role expectations played in constructing them. Instead, the resulting perception appears self-evident. Psychologists have explored similar effects in studies involving pain. Pain may seem like the most direct and objective of experiences, yet expectations can influence it as well. If people believe a treatment will reduce discomfort, they often report meaningful improvements even when the treatment contains no active medical ingredient. This phenomenon, commonly known as the placebo effect, represents one of the most remarkable demonstrations of expectations' power. The experience of pain is genuine. The relief is often genuine as well. Yet part of the change originates from belief. The brain's predictions influence how sensory information is processed. and interpreted. Researchers continue investigating the precise mechanisms involved, but the broader lesson is clear. Expectations do not simply sit alongside experience. They participate in creating it. This principle extends into vision itself. Many visual illusions reveal how strongly expectations shape perception. A familiar example occurs when reading text containing minor errors. People frequently overlook missing letters or transposed words because the brain predicts what should be present and fills gaps automatically. In most circumstances, this predictive ability improves reading speed dramatically. Occasionally, however, the prediction becomes so influential that it overrides the actual information. The eyes may encounter one thing while conscious awareness reports another. Again, the goal of the brain is not perfect accuracy in every detail. Its goal is efficient understanding. Most of the time, prediction helps achieve that objective. Another intriguing area involves memory. People often think of memory as a record of past events. Yet memory and expectation influence one another continuously. What individuals expect to remember can affect what they actually recall. Suppose someone believes a meeting was unpleasant. Over time, memories consistent with that interpretation may become easier to retrieve. Positive details may receive less attention during recall. The overall memory gradually shifts toward the established expectation. This does not necessarily involve deliberate distortion. Rather, memory reconstruction naturally interacts with existing beliefs and assumptions. The past is remembered through the lens of the present. Expectations about identity can produce similar effects. People develop beliefs about who they are. Some view themselves as confident. Others see themselves as shy, creative, analytical, lucky, unlucky, organized, or forgetful. These expectations often influence future experiences. An individual expecting social success may notice positive interactions more readily. Someone anticipating rejection may become more sensitive to signs of disapproval. Both individuals encounter reality through different interpretive frameworks. The world they experience is partially shaped by the expectations they carry into it. Importantly, this does not mean expectations create reality out of nothing. External events still matter enormously. What expectations do is influence which aspects of reality receive emphasis, attention, and interpretation. They act less like inventors and more like editors. They help determine which signals become most prominent within conscious awareness. The influence of expectations becomes especially visible in uncertain situations. When information is incomplete, ambiguous, or unfamiliar, the brain relies more heavily on prediction. A vague sound heard at night may seem comforting or alarming depending on context. An unfamiliar facial expression may appear friendly or threatening, according to prior expectations. The same sensory input can support multiple interpretations. Expectations help determine which interpretation prevails. This tendency reveals something fundamental about human cognition. People are not passive observers standing outside reality and recording it objectively. They are active participants in constructing meaningful experiences from incomplete information. The brain continuously balances sensory evidence against prior knowledge, using both to create a coherent model of the world. Most of the time, this process operates so smoothly that it remains invisible. Only occasionally do psychological experiments expose the machinery beneath the surface. And when they do, they reveal a fascinating truth. Many experiences that feel immediate and objective are quietly shaped by predictions formed long before the moment itself arrived. These predictive systems help people navigate uncertainty efficiently, but they also rely on a collection of mental shortcuts that simplify complex decisions, a set of hidden mechanisms that can be extraordinarily useful, while sometimes leading perception and judgment in unexpected directions. 7. Curious mental shortcuts that distort judgments without notice. The human brain is often compared to a powerful computer, but in some ways that comparison can be misleading. A computer can be instructed to examine every possibility methodically, following rules with remarkable consistency. The human mind faces a different challenge. Every day it must navigate an environment overflowing with information, uncertainty, and decisions. Thousands of judgments arise continuously, many requiring immediate responses. If every choice demanded careful analysis of all available evidence, daily life would become impossibly slow. Instead, the brain relies on mental shortcuts. Psychologists often refer to these shortcuts as heuristics. They are efficient strategies that allow people to make rapid judgments without processing every detail. In many situations, heuristics work remarkably well. They save time, conserve mental energy, and help individuals function effectively in a complex world. Yet the same shortcuts that make decision-making possible can occasionally produce distortions. What makes these distortions especially fascinating is that they often occur without awareness. The resulting judgments feel reasonable, even obvious, despite being influenced by hidden cognitive processes. One of the most studied examples involves the tendency to judge probability according to how easily examples come to mind. Imagine someone asked whether shark attacks or falling airplane parts are more common. Many people immediately think of dramatic news stories involving sharks. Such events are vivid, emotionally engaging, and widely reported. Examples appear quickly in memory. Falling airplane debris, although statistically more frequent in certain contexts, receives far less attention. Few memorable examples come to mind. As a result, the risk of shark attacks may feel larger than it actually is. The brain unconsciously substitutes one question for another. Instead of asking, "How common is this event?" it asks, "How easily can I remember examples?" The shortcut often works because common events are frequently remembered. But the relationship is imperfect. Emotion, novelty, and media exposure also influence memory accessibility. Consequently, what feels probable may differ significantly from what is actually probable. This tendency reveals an important principle. Human judgment often depends less on objective information than on the information most readily available within awareness. A related shortcut appears when people evaluate individuals. Suppose someone is described as intelligent, articulate, confident, and well-dressed. Many observers quickly form a positive overall impression. Once this impression emerges, additional assumptions often follow automatically. The person may be perceived as more trustworthy, competent, or capable than evidence alone would justify. Psychologists sometimes call this the halo effect. A single favorable characteristic spreads across unrelated judgments. The opposite process can occur as well. One negative trait may influence perceptions of entirely separate qualities. The mind prefers coherent stories. Rather than evaluating each characteristic independently, it often builds a unified impression. This simplifies social judgment, but can reduce accuracy. Reality is rarely so neatly organized. People possess mixtures of strengths and weaknesses that resist simple categorization, yet the brain frequently favors efficiency over complexity. Another curious shortcut involves anchoring. When making estimates, individuals often rely heavily on the first number they encounter, even when that number has little relevance. Imagine being asked whether the population of a city exceeds 1 million people, and then estimating its actual population. The initial number serves as an anchor. Subsequent judgments tend to remain surprisingly close to it. Even arbitrary numbers can influence estimates. Researchers have demonstrated this effect repeatedly using random values, unrelated figures, and meaningless reference points. The mind appears reluctant to move too far from an initial starting position. Once a reference point exists, judgment adjusts around it, rather than beginning from scratch. This process often unfolds entirely outside awareness. People believe they are making independent evaluations while remaining subtly influenced by information encountered moments earlier. Patterns also exert a powerful influence on human judgment. The brain evolved to detect regularities within the environment. Recognizing patterns provides enormous advantages. It allows prediction, learning, and adaptation. However, the search for patterns occasionally becomes too enthusiastic. Humans sometimes discover meaningful relationships where none actually exist. A person may notice that several fortunate events occurred after wearing a particular shirt. Another may become convinced that certain numbers possess unusual significance. Someone else may perceive connections between unrelated occurrences simply because they happened close together in time. These interpretations emerge naturally because the mind is designed to seek order. Randomness often feels unsatisfying. Patterns provide explanations. The difficulty lies in distinguishing genuine relationships from coincidental ones. The brain frequently prefers a meaningful story to an admission of uncertainty. Another shortcut involves confirmation bias, one of the most influential phenomena in psychology. Once people form an opinion, they often begin noticing evidence that supports it more readily than evidence that challenges it. This tendency does not usually arise from dishonesty or stubbornness. Instead, attention and memory naturally gravitate toward information consistent with existing beliefs. Imagine two individuals holding different views about the same issue. Both encounter identical streams of information, yet each may notice different details, remember different examples, and interpret ambiguous evidence differently. The result is a fascinating paradox. Both individuals may sincerely believe the facts support their position. Their conclusions emerge not solely from the information available, but also from the way that information is processed. Confirmation bias illustrates how perception itself can become selective. The brain is not merely collecting evidence, it is organizing evidence within existing frameworks. Mental shortcuts also affect judgments about the future. People often display what psychologists call optimism bias. Many individuals believe positive outcomes are more likely for themselves than statistics would suggest. They may underestimate certain risks while overestimating opportunities for success. This tendency varies across situations and individuals, yet it appears remarkably widespread. From a strictly logical perspective, such optimism may seem irrational, yet some researchers argue it may serve psychological functions. Optimistic expectations can encourage persistence, motivation, and resilience. In this sense, certain cognitive distortions may persist because they offer advantages despite occasional inaccuracies. Not every shortcut exists solely to maximize precision. Some may help support effective action. Perhaps one of the strangest shortcuts involves hindsight bias. After an event occurs, people often feel they knew the outcome all along. A surprising election result suddenly seems predictable. An unexpected business failure appears obvious in retrospect. A sports outcome feels inevitable after the final score becomes known. The past transforms. Once the outcome is available, memories of prior uncertainty become difficult to reconstruct accurately. The brain weaves new information into existing narratives, creating a sense of coherence. What once felt uncertain now appears foreseeable. This process helps maintain a stable understanding of the world, but it can create the illusion that events were easier to predict than they truly were. Taken together, these shortcuts reveal something deeply important about human cognition. The brain is not a detached, calculating machine designed solely for objective accuracy. It is a practical system shaped by millions of years of adaptation. Its primary goal is often efficiency rather than perfection. Most of the time, heuristics work extraordinarily well. Occasionally, however, the same mechanisms produce subtle distortions. Probability feels different from reality. Patterns emerge from randomness. First impressions spread beyond available evidence. Expectations influence interpretation. The resulting judgments feel natural because the processes generating them operate largely beneath awareness. And among the many experiences shaped by these hidden mental shortcuts, few are as intriguing as the way they influence our perception of time itself, a phenomenon that can make a single hour seem endless in one moment and vanish almost instantly in another. 8. Why time sometimes feels faster and sometimes slower. Time appears to be one of the most stable features of reality. Seconds pass at a constant rate. Clocks advance steadily. Days follow nights with remarkable consistency. From a physical perspective, time seems dependable and objective. Yet human experience tells a different story. An hour spent waiting in an airport can feel surprisingly long. The same hour spent in an engaging conversation may seem to vanish almost instantly. Childhood summers often appear vast and endless when remembered decades later, while entire years of adulthood sometimes seem to pass with startling speed. The clock remains unchanged. What changes is the mind's experience of time. This difference has fascinated psychologists for generations because it reveals something profound about consciousness. Human beings do not experience time directly. Instead, they experience events, attention, memory, emotion, and expectation. The feeling of time emerges from these processes rather than existing as a separate sense. Unlike vision, hearing, or touch, there is no dedicated organ for perceiving time. The brain constructs temporal experience from many different sources of information. This helps explain why subjective time can be so flexible. One of the strongest influences involves attention. Imagine sitting quietly in a waiting room with nothing particular to do. Attention often turns inward. Small details become noticeable. Thoughts drift. The passing minutes attract awareness. In such situations, people frequently become conscious of time itself. Each moment receives relatively close inspection. As a result, time often feels slower. Now consider a different scenario. Someone becomes deeply absorbed in a fascinating activity. Perhaps they are solving a problem, reading an engaging book, building something, or participating in a lively conversation. Attention shifts away from the passage of time and toward the activity. Moments continue unfolding at exactly the same physical rate, yet awareness is occupied elsewhere. When the activity ends, the person may be surprised to discover how much time has passed. The difference is not the clock. The difference is where attention was directed. Psychologists sometimes describe this in terms of cognitive resources. Attention is limited. The more resources devoted to monitoring time, the slower time tends to feel. The fewer resources devoted to time monitoring, the faster it often seems. This principle helps explain many familiar experiences. Waiting for important news can make minutes feel unusually long because attention repeatedly returns to the passage of time. Exciting activities often produce the opposite effect because attention becomes concentrated elsewhere. Emotion introduces another layer of complexity. Certain emotional states appear capable of stretching or compressing subjective time. Fear provides a striking example. Individuals involved in accidents or sudden emergencies frequently report that events seem to unfold in slow motion. Details appear unusually vivid. Brief moments feel expanded. Interestingly, research suggests that people may not actually perceive more information during these events. Instead, the memory formed afterward contains an unusually rich collection of details. Because the memory is dense and elaborate, the experience may seem longer in retrospect. The brain responds to threatening situations by allocating substantial resources to processing information. Attention intensifies. Awareness narrows. Memory formation strengthens. The resulting experience can create the impression that time itself slowed down. In reality, what changed was the way information was processed. Boredom produces a different kind of temporal distortion. When stimulation is limited and engagement remains low, people often become highly aware of the passage of time. Without sufficient novelty to occupy attention, moments seem to drag. Many childhood experiences illustrate this vividly. Long car rides, routine errands, and repetitive activities often felt endless. Part of the reason involves attentional focus. When little else captures interest, awareness naturally shifts toward waiting itself. The clock becomes psychologically louder. The passage of time becomes a central feature of experience. Memory plays an equally fascinating role. The way people experience time in the present differs from the way they evaluate time afterward. A vacation offers a useful example. During the trip itself, time may seem to pass quickly because attention is absorbed by activities and experiences. Yet when looking back months later, the vacation often appears surprisingly substantial. The reason involves memory density. Novel experiences create many distinct memories. New places, unfamiliar situations, unexpected encounters, and unique observations generate rich mental records. When people later review these memories, the period appears full and expansive. A routine week at home may occupy more actual time, yet leave fewer memorable traces. Consequently, it can seem shorter in retrospect. This distinction between experienced time and remembered time helps explain one of the great mysteries of adulthood. Many people feel that years pass more quickly as they grow older. Several psychological theories attempt to explain this phenomenon. One possibility involves novelty. Childhood contains a constant stream of first experiences. First friendships, first schools, first discoveries, first journeys, first achievements. The world contains countless unfamiliar elements. Each new experience creates detailed memories. As life becomes more routine, genuinely novel experiences often become less frequent. Familiar patterns dominate daily life. Work routines stabilize. Environments become predictable. The brain processes familiar experiences efficiently. Fewer distinct memories are formed. When looking back, long stretches of time may therefore appear compressed, not because time passed faster, but because fewer memorable markers remain. In a sense, memory provides the landmarks used to navigate the past. When landmarks become sparse, entire periods seem smaller. Expectations also influence temporal perception. Research suggests that anticipated events can alter the feeling of waiting. A pleasant future event often creates a mixture of excitement and impatience. People monitor time more closely as the event approaches. Days may feel slow because attention repeatedly checks progress toward the anticipated moment. Conversely, unpleasant future events sometimes create different distortions. People may avoid thinking about them altogether or experience periods of heightened temporal awareness, depending on emotional context. The future affects the present not only through planning but also through perception. Social situations reveal another curious pattern. Time often feels different when shared with others. Conversations, gatherings, and collaborative activities frequently alter temporal awareness. Social interaction generates continuous streams of information. Facial expressions, speech, body language, humor, and emotional cues demand attention. As cognitive resources become engaged, awareness of time itself often recedes. This may help explain why meaningful conversations sometimes seem surprisingly brief despite lasting hours. The mind becomes occupied with interpreting people rather than monitoring clocks. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of temporal perception is what it reveals about consciousness. Time feels like a direct feature of reality, yet psychological evidence suggests it is partly constructed by the brain. Attention, emotion, novelty, memory, expectation, and social engagement all contribute to its texture. The result is a temporal experience that remains flexible despite the steady progression of physical time. Minutes can stretch, years can contract. Entire chapters of life can seem larger or smaller depending on how they were experienced and remembered. And among the many factors that quietly shape these perceptions, few are more surprising than the subtle influence of identity itself. Beginning with something most people receive before they can speak, a simple name that may affect how others perceive them and even how they perceive themselves. 9. The hidden influence of names on perception and behavior. A name is one of the first pieces of information people learn about one another. It appears simple enough, a short collection of sounds, a label used to identify an individual within a family, a school, a workplace, or a community. Most people rarely stop to consider it. A name often feels like a neutral fact, no more psychologically significant than a number on a house or a title on a document. Yet researchers have spent decades exploring whether names influence perception and behavior in subtle ways, and the findings suggest that this small element of identity may exert effects that are both surprising and far-reaching. The influence begins almost immediately. When people encounter an unfamiliar individual, they often possess very little information. Before observing personality, intelligence, kindness, or competence, the mind begins constructing impressions from whatever clues are available. A name can become one of those clues. Without realizing it, people may associate certain names with characteristics they have encountered previously. Past experiences, cultural expectations, media portrayals, and social patterns all contribute to these associations. The process happens rapidly. A name may evoke feelings of familiarity, formality, warmth, youthfulness, tradition, modernity, or countless other impressions. Importantly, these impressions often arise before any meaningful interaction has occurred. This does not mean such judgments are accurate. In many cases, they are not. Yet the psychological tendency itself reveals how quickly the human mind searches for patterns. The brain dislikes uncertainty. When information is limited, It eagerly uses whatever signals are available to generate expectations. Names become part of that process. One fascinating area of research examines pronunciation. People generally prefer things that are easy to process mentally. Psychologists sometimes refer to this principle as processing fluency. Information that feels effortless to understand often produces a subtle sense of comfort. Words that are easy to read may seem more familiar. Statements that are easier to pronounce may feel more believable. Objects that are easier to recognize often appear more appealing. Names are not immune to this effect. Studies have suggested that names which are easier for people within a given culture to pronounce may create slightly more favorable initial impressions than names that feel unfamiliar or difficult. The effect is usually small, yet it highlights an important aspect of human cognition. The brain often mistakes ease of processing for positive qualities. What feels familiar can seem trustworthy. What feels effortless can appear preferable. Another intriguing phenomenon involves the relationship between names and memory. In social environments, being remembered matters. A distinctive name may attract attention because it stands apart from others. At the same time, extremely unusual names may sometimes be harder to recall accurately. Common names present a different challenge. They may feel familiar but risk blending together. The balance between distinctiveness and familiarity influences how individuals are remembered within groups. This can subtly shape social experiences over time. The effects are not necessarily dramatic. Rather, they accumulate through countless interactions, each one influenced by tiny differences in attention and recall. Names can also influence expectations in educational settings. Researchers studying classroom environments have occasionally found evidence that teachers, like all humans, are susceptible to unconscious assumptions. A student's name may activate expectations before any work has been evaluated. Most educators strive to treat students fairly and professionally. Nevertheless, the human mind naturally generates predictions from available information. Sometimes these predictions prove accurate, sometimes they do not. The important point is that expectations can influence perception. The same assignment may be interpreted slightly differently depending on the assumptions already present. This principle extends beyond classrooms into many areas of social life. Job applications, introductions, interviews, and first meetings all involve situations where limited information encourages rapid judgment. A name becomes one small ingredient within a larger psychological recipe. Perhaps even more surprising are studies examining what psychologists call implicit egotism. This theory proposes that people possess subtle preferences for things associated with themselves. Most individuals generally hold positive feelings toward aspects of their own identity. These feelings may extend beyond conscious awareness and influence preferences in unexpected ways. Researchers have explored whether people are drawn toward places, professions, or choices that resemble elements of their own names. Some studies have suggested intriguing patterns, although the evidence remains debated and interpretations vary. Regardless of the specific findings, the broader concept is fascinating. The self may exert influence in ways people rarely notice. Identity does not remain confined to conscious thought. It can quietly shape preferences beneath awareness. Names occupy a central place within that identity. Another reason names matter involves repetition. A person's name is among the words they hear most frequently throughout life. Parents say it, teachers say it, friends say it, colleagues say it. Over time, the brain develops extraordinary familiarity with these sounds. Researchers have found that hearing one's own name captures attention in unique ways. Even within noisy environments, individuals often notice their name being spoken nearby. This phenomenon is sometimes called the cocktail party effect. A room may contain dozens of conversations, yet a single mention of one's name can suddenly draw attention across the noise. The effect illustrates how deeply personal relevance influences perception. The brain continuously monitors for information connected to the self. Names function as highly efficient signals. They act almost like psychological magnets for attention. This relationship between names and identity becomes even more interesting when considering self-perception. People often develop narratives about who they are. These narratives emerge from experiences, relationships, memories, and social feedback. Names frequently become intertwined with those narratives. Over time, a name can accumulate layers of personal meaning. It becomes associated with successes, failures, friendships, aspirations, and countless moments of daily life. Hearing the name may therefore activate not only recognition, but also aspects of self-concept. The simple sound carries an entire history. Cultural factors add further complexity. Names vary enormously across societies, and their meanings often extend beyond identification. They may reflect family traditions, historical events, religious influences, geographic origins, or social values. Consequently, names sometimes communicate information about group membership and cultural background. Observers may consciously or unconsciously incorporate these signals into their perceptions. Again, such interpretations are not always accurate, yet the tendency demonstrates how readily humans extract meaning from limited information. The mind continuously searches for clues. Even a name can become a source of assumptions. Perhaps the most important lesson from all of this research is not that names determine destiny. The evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. Personality, opportunity, environment, effort, relationships, and countless other influences play far larger roles in shaping a person's life. What the research reveals instead is something subtler. Small pieces of information can influence perception in ways that remain largely invisible. A name may affect first impressions, attention, memory, and expectations, without anyone consciously noticing the process. These influences are usually modest, yet they remind us that social perception is rarely as objective as it feels. Human beings constantly interpret one another through layers of assumptions, associations, and mental shortcuts, and nowhere do those social influences become more apparent than in situations where the mere presence of other people changes behavior itself, often producing effects that are both unexpected and remarkably powerful. 10. How social presence changes performance in unexpected ways. Human beings are rarely alone in a psychological sense. Even when sitting quietly in a room, people often carry an awareness of others. Friends, family members, colleagues, strangers, audiences, and entire communities exist within the mental landscape. Social life influences perception and behavior so deeply that it can be difficult to separate individual thought from social context. One of the most intriguing discoveries in psychology is that the mere presence of other people can alter performance, sometimes helping and sometimes hindering, often in ways that feel surprising. At first glance, this seems strange. If two people perform the same task with identical abilities, why should the simple presence of an observer make any difference? After all, the task itself remains unchanged. Yet research repeatedly suggests that social presence can influence attention, motivation, decision-making, memory, and physical performance. The effect emerges across a remarkable range of situations. Consider a familiar experience. Someone practices a skill alone and performs comfortably. The same individual then attempts the identical activity in front of others and suddenly feels different. A musician notices increased tension. A speaker becomes more aware of each word. An athlete senses heightened energy. A student taking a test feels unusual pressure. Nothing about the task has changed. What has changed is the social environment. One of the earliest psychological explanations for this phenomenon involves what researchers call social facilitation. The basic observation is surprisingly simple. For tasks that are well learned or relatively easy, the presence of others often improves performance. People may respond faster, work harder, or display greater efficiency. For difficult or unfamiliar tasks, however, the opposite effect can occur. Performance may decline. This pattern initially puzzled researchers. Why would the same social presence produce opposite outcomes? One influential explanation suggests that the presence of others increases physiological arousal. The brain becomes more alert, attention sharpens, energy levels rise. When a task is simple or highly practiced, this increased activation helps performance. Existing skills become easier to execute quickly and confidently. When a task is complex or unfamiliar, however, Heightened arousal may interfere with careful thinking. Mistakes become more likely. Concentration becomes less stable. The very mechanism that helps one situation can hinder another. This helps explain why experienced performers often thrive before audiences, while beginners may struggle. The audience amplifies whatever response is already dominant. If skill and confidence are present, performance may improve. If uncertainty dominates, performance may suffer. The same principle appears in sports. Athletes frequently describe the energizing effect of spectators. Crowds can create a sense of momentum. Effort increases. Motivation strengthens. Physical performance sometimes improves. Yet pressure can also produce what athletes commonly call choking under pressure. A skill normally executed automatically suddenly feels awkward. Movements become overanalyzed. Attention shifts from performing the task to monitoring the performance itself. This shift can be surprisingly disruptive. Many everyday skills operate best when they remain partially automatic. Walking, typing, speaking, and numerous athletic movements rely on patterns developed through repetition. When individuals become excessively self-conscious, they may begin interfering with processes that usually function smoothly. The result is a curious paradox. Trying harder can sometimes make performance worse. Social presence contributes because it increases awareness of being evaluated. The possibility of judgment changes attention. Instead of focusing entirely on the task, part of the mind begins considering how the performance appears to others. This additional layer of monitoring consumes cognitive resources. The effect extends beyond physical performance into intellectual activities. Imagine solving a difficult puzzle alone. Attention remains directed toward the problem. Now imagine solving the same puzzle while several people watch silently. The social context changes the experience. Awareness becomes divided between the puzzle and the observers. Even subtle concerns about evaluation may influence thinking. This does not necessarily mean performance declines. Sometimes motivation increases enough to compensate. What matters is that social presence alters the psychological environment in which thinking occurs. Another fascinating phenomenon involves effort. People often work differently when others are present. In certain situations, individuals exert greater effort because they wish to demonstrate competence or avoid appearing careless. The possibility of observation encourages persistence. Tasks that might otherwise receive minimal attention become more important. This tendency helps explain why some people find it easier to exercise with training partners, study in libraries, or complete projects alongside colleagues. The social environment provides a form of accountability. Others need not say anything. Their presence alone can influence behavior. Yet social presence does not always increase effort. Under some circumstances, individuals contribute less when working within groups. Psychologists refer to this tendency as social loafing. When responsibility becomes distributed across many people, each individual may feel less personally accountable. Effort declines because someone else is expected to compensate. The effect illustrates an important point. Social influences are rarely straightforward. The same presence of others that increases motivation in one situation may reduce it in another. Everything depends on context, expectations, and perceived responsibility. The role of observation becomes particularly interesting when considering morality and cooperation. Researchers have discovered that even subtle cues suggesting observation can influence behavior. Images of eyes, for example, have occasionally been associated with increased cooperative behavior in certain experimental settings. The effect remains an active area of study, but the broader implication is fascinating. Humans appear highly sensitive to social monitoring. The possibility of being observed activates psychological systems related to reputation and social evaluation. This sensitivity likely reflects deep evolutionary roots. For most of human history, social relationships were essential for survival. Reputation affected access to cooperation, resources, and support. As a result, awareness of observers became psychologically significant. Modern life may differ dramatically from ancestral environments, yet the underlying mechanisms remain. Another unexpected consequence of social presence involves emotion. People often experience emotions differently depending on whether they are alone or with others. Laughter spreads more easily through groups. Excitement can become contagious. Anxiety may intensify when shared. Confidence sometimes grows through collective experience. Human emotions are not entirely private phenomena. They frequently emerge within social systems. The reactions of others provide information about how situations should be interpreted. A crowd's response influences individual perception. This process helps explain why events often feel different when experienced collectively, rather than alone. A movie watched in a theater creates a different atmosphere than the same movie viewed in isolation. A sporting event feels different in a stadium than on a television screen. Shared attention alters subjective experience. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of social presence is how effortlessly it operates. Most people are unaware of the countless ways others influence their behavior. The effects often occur beneath conscious awareness. An observer enters the room, and attention shifts slightly. A group forms, and effort changes. An audience gathers, and performance transforms. The task itself remains the same. The social context quietly reshapes it. These findings reveal a broader truth about human psychology. Individuals are not isolated decision-making machines acting independently of their surroundings. They are deeply social organisms whose thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are continuously influenced by the presence of others. And among the most intriguing consequences of this social nature is the way memory itself can be affected, sometimes producing recollections that feel perfectly accurate despite containing details that were never actually experienced at all. 11. Strange memory illusions that feel completely accurate afterward. Memory often feels like one of the most reliable parts of the mind. People may doubt rumors, question predictions, or challenge opinions, but memories frequently carry a special sense of certainty. A remembered event can seem solid and trustworthy, as though it exists as a preserved recording stored somewhere inside the brain. When a memory feels vivid, detailed, and emotionally clear, confidence naturally follows. Yet one of the most surprising discoveries in psychology is that confidence and accuracy are not always the same thing. The human memory system is extraordinarily powerful, but it is not designed to function like a video camera. Instead, memory is a dynamic process that reconstructs experiences from many different pieces. Most of the time, this reconstruction works remarkably well. Occasionally, however, it creates convincing illusions. What makes these illusions fascinating is not merely that they occur, it is that they often feel completely real. A person may remember something vividly and sincerely, while certain details are inaccurate, altered, or entirely invented. To understand why this happens, it helps to reconsider what memory actually does. The primary purpose of memory is not simply preserving the past. From an evolutionary perspective, memory exists largely to support future behavior. It helps people recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, avoid danger, maintain relationships, and navigate complex environments. To accomplish these goals, the brain stores meaning more efficiently than exact detail. When recalling an experience, people often reconstruct the broader situation rather than retrieving every element precisely as it occurred. Most of the time, this approach is highly practical. If someone remembers that a friend was kind during a conversation, exact recollection of every sentence may be unnecessary. The essential meaning is preserved even if minor details fade. Problems arise when reconstruction fills gaps with information that feels plausible but was never actually present. One of the most famous examples comes from studies involving lists of related words. Participants might hear words such as pillow, dream, blanket, bed, rest, tired, and night. Later, many confidently remember hearing the word sleep. The word fits the overall theme so perfectly that the brain often inserts it into memory. Participants are not guessing. Many genuinely believe they heard it. The memory feels authentic, yet the word was never presented. This phenomenon reveals how strongly memory depends upon meaning and association. The brain stores relationships among ideas, not merely isolated facts. During recall, strongly connected concepts may become woven into the reconstructed memory. The resulting recollection feels seamless because it aligns with the larger pattern. Another fascinating illusion involves the misinformation effect. Imagine witnessing an event and later hearing someone describe it using slightly inaccurate details. Perhaps a vehicle is described as moving faster than it actually was. Perhaps an object is mentioned that was not present. Over time, these suggestions can sometimes become incorporated into memory itself. The original experience and the later information begin blending together. Eventually, the altered version may feel entirely genuine. This does not imply weakness or gullibility. The effect arises because memory is not stored as a fixed archive. Each act of remembering involves reconstruction, and reconstruction remains open to influence. New information can become integrated into existing memories without conscious awareness. The boundary between remembering and imagining is often thinner than people assume. Imagination itself plays an important role. Research suggests that repeatedly imagining an event can sometimes increase confidence that it actually occurred. The imagined scenario becomes familiar. Details become easier to visualize. The growing familiarity may then be mistaken for evidence that the event truly happened. This creates an intriguing psychological challenge. The brain frequently uses familiarity as a cue for truth. Information that feels familiar often seems more believable. Unfortunately, familiarity can arise through repetition as easily as through genuine experience. A memory revisited many times may feel increasingly certain regardless of its accuracy. This helps explain why some false memories can become remarkably convincing. The feeling of certainty originates not from objective verification, but from repeated mental rehearsal. Another strange feature of memory involves source monitoring. When recalling information, people often remember the content more easily than its origin. A person may clearly remember hearing a fact while forgetting where it came from. Was it a friend, a news article, a movie, a dream? The source sometimes fades faster than the information itself. As a result, ideas from different origins can become mixed together. Details encountered separately may merge into a single coherent memory. The brain prioritizes useful information, not necessarily perfect documentation of how that information was acquired. This tendency contributes to many everyday memory distortions. Memory also interacts closely with emotion. Highly emotional experiences often feel exceptionally vivid. People frequently assume that vividness guarantees accuracy, yet emotional intensity can strengthen confidence more reliably than precision. Certain aspects of an event may indeed be remembered well. Others may become distorted, simplified, or exaggerated. The overall memory feels powerful because the emotional significance remains strong. Confidence follows naturally. However, confidence alone cannot guarantee factual correctness. Psychologists have repeatedly observed situations in which highly confident individuals recall events inaccurately while remaining completely sincere. This finding can feel unsettling because it challenges a deeply held intuition. Most people expect certainty to indicate truth. Memory demonstrates that the relationship is more complicated. Collective memory introduces another layer of complexity. Groups often influence one another's recollections. Friends discussing a shared experience may gradually align their memories. Family stories repeated over decades can evolve, while retaining a sense of authenticity. Eventually, individuals may remember details not because they personally witnessed them, but because they heard them repeatedly from others. The memory becomes socially constructed, yet it still feels personal. This process highlights the social nature of remembering. Memories do not exist in isolation. They are frequently shaped through conversation, storytelling, and shared interpretation. One of the most curious examples of memory illusion involves hindsight. After learning an outcome, people often feel they predicted it beforehand. A surprising event suddenly seems obvious. Warning signs appear clearer than they actually were. The uncertainty that existed before the outcome becomes difficult to reconstruct. The mind rewrites the past slightly to create a more coherent narrative. The resulting memory feels natural because humans prefer stories that make sense. Uncertainty is messy. Completed narratives are satisfying. Memory often gravitates toward coherence, even when doing so sacrifices accuracy. Despite all these distortions, it is important to remember that memory remains extraordinarily useful. People generally remember the important structure of their lives remarkably well. Relationships, experiences, lessons, and personal histories remain meaningful even when specific details shift. The existence of memory illusions does not mean memory is broken. Rather, it reveals what memory was designed to do. The system evolved to extract meaning, support decision-making, and create continuity across time. Absolute precision was never its primary objective. What makes these findings so fascinating is that they reveal how much of reality is reconstructed rather than simply recorded. The past that people carry within their minds is not a perfect archive, but an active, evolving interpretation. And among the many experiences that challenge human intuitions about probability, memory, and prediction, few are more intriguing than the rare coincidences that seem impossible when they occur, yet arise far more often than intuition would suggest. 12. Why rare coincidences seem impossible yet happen regularly. Few experiences create a stronger sense of mystery than a coincidence. A person thinks about an old friend and receives a message from that friend moments later. Someone encounters the same unusual name twice in a single day after never noticing it before. Two strangers discover an astonishing number of shared experiences. A forgotten song suddenly appears in multiple places within a short period of time. When such events occur, they often feel extraordinary. The immediate reaction is frequently the same. What are the chances? The coincidence appears so unlikely that it seems to demand a special explanation. Yet psychologists, mathematicians, and statisticians have long pointed out something curious. Rare coincidences are not only possible in a world containing billions of people, countless interactions, and endless opportunities for chance events, they may be surprisingly inevitable. The challenge lies in the way the human mind intuitively understands probability. People are generally quite good at navigating everyday uncertainty. They can estimate risks, recognize patterns, and make practical judgments in complex environments. However, probability on a large scale often behaves differently from intuition expects. As a result, genuinely random events can appear almost magical. One reason coincidences seem so surprising involves selective attention. Imagine thinking about hundreds of people throughout a month. Most of those thoughts produce no unusual outcome. Nothing noteworthy happens. The moments are forgotten. Then one day, a thought about a particular friend is followed by an unexpected phone call from that person. This event stands out immediately. The successful match receives attention. The countless non-matches disappear into the background. The brain naturally highlights meaningful connections while ignoring ordinary absences. This tendency makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Noticing potentially important relationships often carries more value than cataloging every instance where nothing happened. Yet it can create a distorted sense of rarity. People remember the remarkable coincidence while overlooking the enormous number of opportunities for coincidence that produced nothing unusual. The same principle appears in many aspects of life. Human attention tends to focus on striking outcomes rather than the larger context surrounding them. Another important factor involves the sheer number of events occurring every day. Most people underestimate how many opportunities exist for improbable things to happen. Consider a single day. Millions of conversations occur. Millions of emails are sent. Millions of phone calls are made. Millions of people encounter names, numbers, faces, places, and ideas. Each interaction creates opportunities for unexpected overlap. When enough opportunities exist, highly improbable events become surprisingly likely. A classic example comes from what statisticians call the birthday problem. Suppose a group of 23 people gathers in a room. Many individuals assume the probability that two people share a birthday must be relatively low. After all, there are 365 possible birthdays. Yet the actual probability exceeds 50%. The result feels counterintuitive because people focus on comparing one birthday against another rather than considering all possible pairs within the group. The number of potential matches grows rapidly. What appears unlikely from one perspective becomes quite probable from another. Coincidences often operate according to similar principles. The human mind tends to evaluate a single remarkable outcome while overlooking the vast number of alternative outcomes that would have seemed equally remarkable. Imagine meeting a stranger while traveling and discovering that both of you attended the same small school years earlier. The coincidence feels astonishing, yet countless other surprising connections might have produced the same reaction. Perhaps you could have shared a hometown. Perhaps you both knew the same teacher. Perhaps you visited the same obscure location. Perhaps you owned the same unusual pet. The specific coincidence feels unique, because it happened. All the other possible coincidences remain invisible because they did not. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a problem of selective framing. The event is evaluated after the fact rather than before it occurs. Once the coincidence happens, it appears extraordinarily specific. Before it happened, however, countless potential coincidences were available. The mind rarely considers the full range of possibilities. Pattern recognition also plays a major role. Human beings evolved to detect meaningful relationships within the environment. This ability provides enormous advantages. Recognizing connections helps people learn from experience, anticipate future events, and navigate uncertainty. The challenge is that the same pattern detection systems occasionally identify significance within random occurrences. A coincidence presents exactly the kind of situation that attracts these systems. Two unrelated events appear connected. The brain immediately begins searching for meaning. Was there a hidden cause, a deeper relationship, some unseen force linking the events together? These questions arise naturally because humans are storytelling creatures. Randomness often feels psychologically unsatisfying. Meaning feels more comfortable. Narratives transform isolated events into coherent structures. As a result, coincidences frequently acquire significance beyond their statistical reality. Memory further amplifies the effect. Coincidences tend to be emotionally engaging. They surprise us. They provoke curiosity. They generate conversation. Consequently, they are remembered far more effectively than ordinary events. A routine day fades quickly from memory. An unusual coincidence may remain vivid for years. This difference creates another subtle distortion. Because coincidences are memorable, they seem more common than they actually are. The mind retrieves them easily and interprets their availability as evidence of frequency. The same cognitive shortcut appears in many areas of judgment. Events that are memorable often feel more common than events that are mundane. Another fascinating aspect of coincidence involves personal relevance. The most striking coincidences are usually those connected to individual experience. A stranger sharing a birthday with another stranger may seem mildly interesting. A stranger sharing your birthday feels far more remarkable. The statistical reality remains identical. The emotional impact changes dramatically. Personal relevance increases attention, memory, and perceived significance. The self functions as a powerful organizing principle within cognition. Events connected to personal identity naturally attract greater interest. Consequently, coincidences involving oneself often feel especially meaningful. Some researchers have suggested that this tendency reflects a broader feature of consciousness. Human beings experience the world from a first-person perspective. Events connected to the self occupy a privileged position within awareness. Coincidences occurring around personal concerns therefore seem larger and more significant than objectively equivalent events occurring elsewhere. Perhaps the most important lesson from the psychology of coincidence is not that surprising events are meaningless. Many coincidences genuinely are remarkable. Some reflect hidden connections. Others reveal unexpected relationships between people, places, and experiences. The point is that remarkable events need not violate probability. In fact, probability often predicts that remarkable events will occur. Given enough opportunities, enough people, and enough time, highly unusual outcomes become unavoidable. The world is simply larger and more interconnected than intuition naturally assumes. What feels impossible may actually be expected under the mathematics of large numbers. And yet, even when probability provides an explanation, the emotional power of coincidence remains. A surprising connection still feels surprising. A chance encounter still feels extraordinary. The human mind continues searching for meaning within unexpected patterns. That search itself reflects something deeply characteristic of our psychology, a tendency that becomes especially visible when examining fears that persist despite knowing, at least rationally, that the situation poses little real danger. 13. The psychology behind irrational fears of harmless situations. Most people can identify at least one fear that seems difficult to explain. A person may feel uneasy standing on a glass observation deck, despite knowing it was engineered for safety. Someone else may become anxious around harmless insects, uncomfortable inside elevators, nervous while speaking before a friendly audience, or unsettled by completely ordinary situations that pose little objective threat. What makes these experiences particularly interesting is that individuals often recognize the mismatch themselves. They know the situation is relatively safe. They understand that the probability of harm is extremely low. Yet the fear persists. This apparent contradiction has fascinated psychologists for decades, because it reveals an important distinction between knowledge and emotion. Knowing something intellectually is not always enough to change how it feels. The emotional systems responsible for fear operate according to principles that differ from deliberate reasoning. They evolved for speed, not perfect accuracy. In many cases, their purpose is not to calculate precise probabilities but to promote survival in uncertain environments. To understand why harmless situations can feel threatening, it helps to begin with the evolutionary origins of fear. For most of human history, survival depended upon responding quickly to potential dangers. Delaying action until complete information became available could be costly. Imagine hearing movement in tall grass thousands of years ago. The sound might indicate a harmless animal. It might also indicate a predator. From a survival perspective, overreacting occasionally was often safer than underreacting. A false alarm carried a relatively small cost. Failing to respond to a genuine threat could carry a much larger one. As a result, natural selection favored systems that erred on the side of caution. The human brain became highly sensitive to potential danger. This sensitivity remains useful today. Fear helps people avoid risky situations, respond rapidly during emergencies, and pay attention to important warning signals. Yet modern environments differ dramatically from those in which these systems evolved. Many situations that trigger fear no longer represent meaningful threats. The emotional machinery remains active even when objective danger is absent. One reason irrational fears develop involves associative learning. The brain excels at connecting events that occur together. If a frightening experience happens in a particular context, elements of that context may later trigger fear independently. Suppose a child experiences intense distress while riding in an elevator. The emotional state becomes associated with the elevator itself. Years later, elevators may continue producing anxiety despite being perfectly safe. The original danger no longer exists. The learned association remains. This process often unfolds automatically. The brain records the relationship without requiring conscious intention. In many cases, individuals cannot clearly remember how the association began. They simply experience the fear. Another fascinating aspect of fear involves uncertainty. Psychological research repeatedly suggests that uncertainty can be more uncomfortable than known outcomes. A harmless situation may still contain elements that feel unpredictable. An airplane passenger, for example, has little control over the flight. Most flights are extremely safe, yet uncertainty remains. The inability to monitor or influence events directly can increase anxiety. The same principle appears in many fears. The concern often centers less on actual danger and more on uncertainty about what might happen. The imagination plays a surprisingly powerful role here. Humans possess an extraordinary ability to simulate possible futures. This capacity allows planning, preparation, and problem-solving, yet it also enables people to imagine unlikely disasters in vivid detail. A person standing on a balcony may suddenly picture falling. Someone speaking publicly may imagine humiliation. An individual boarding an airplane may visualize a crash despite understanding how rare such events are. The mind generates possibilities automatically. Fear systems respond to those possibilities even when rational analysis rejects them. The result can feel confusing. Part of the brain recognizes safety. Another part responds as though danger might still exist. Attention further amplifies these experiences. When individuals become fearful, attention often narrows toward potential threats. The brain begins scanning for signs of danger. This scanning process increases the likelihood of noticing ambiguous cues. A small bodily sensation becomes significant. A harmless sound attracts concern. Minor irregularities receive disproportionate attention. The fear appears validated because evidence seems to accumulate, yet much of that evidence becomes visible only because attention is actively searching for it. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Fear increases vigilance. Vigilance increases detection of potential threats. Perceived threats strengthen fear. The loop continues. Importantly, The individual is not imagining the experience. The sensations and emotions are genuine. What changes is the interpretation of available information. Social learning provides another pathway through which irrational fears emerge. Human beings learn not only from direct experience, but also from observing others. A child who repeatedly watches a parent react fearfully to certain situations may acquire similar responses. No personal danger is required. Observation alone can shape emotional reactions. This mechanism serves important functions. Learning from others allows people to avoid risks without experiencing them firsthand. However, it can also transmit fears that lack objective justification. The brain often treats socially acquired information seriously because, throughout human history, other people frequently possessed valuable knowledge about dangers. Modern fears sometimes reflect the same learning processes, operating in environments where the original threat is absent or exaggerated. Interestingly, certain fears appear unusually common across cultures. Heights, snakes, spiders, darkness, and social rejection frequently attract strong emotional responses. Some researchers argue that humans may possess evolved predispositions that make these fears easier to acquire. This does not mean people are born afraid of specific objects. Rather, the brain may be especially prepared to learn certain associations quickly. Historically, these concerns often carried survival significance. As a result, they may receive preferential treatment from fear-related systems. Meanwhile, modern dangers such as electrical hazards or cybercrime rarely trigger the same instinctive reactions despite posing genuine risks. The emotional brain reflects ancient priorities more readily than contemporary statistics. One of the strangest aspects of irrational fear involves avoidance. Avoidance feels helpful in the short term. A feared situation is escaped. Anxiety decreases. Relief follows. From the brain's perspective, this sequence appears successful. The avoidance behavior receives reinforcement, yet something important is lost. The opportunity to learn that the situation was safe never occurs. Because the feared experience is avoided, the original belief remains unchallenged. The fear survives. In some cases, it grows stronger over time. The absence of negative outcomes is attributed not to safety, but to successful avoidance. This mechanism helps explain why fears can persist for years despite repeated opportunities for disconfirmation. The emotional system continues operating according to outdated assumptions. Perhaps the most revealing lesson from irrational fears is that human beings do not experience reality directly. They experience interpretations of reality. Those interpretations emerge from learning, memory, attention, imagination, social influence, and evolutionary history. The resulting emotions often make sense when viewed through the lens of how the brain was designed to function. Fear is not attempting to provide a perfectly accurate statistical analysis. It is attempting to keep the individual safe. Sometimes it succeeds brilliantly. Sometimes it identifies threats where none exist. And just as fear can alter attention and interpretation, so too can a wide range of emotions quietly influence what people notice, remember, and believe, a subtle process shaping countless decisions without ever announcing its presence. 14. How emotions quietly alter attention, recall, and reasoning. Emotions often feel like responses to experience. Something happens in the world, and an emotional reaction follows. A pleasant surprise creates happiness. A disappointment produces frustration. A threat generates fear. A loss brings sadness. From this perspective, emotions appear to arrive after perception and thought, adding color to experiences that have already been interpreted. Yet psychology increasingly suggests that the relationship works in both directions. Emotions do not merely respond to reality. They also help shape how reality is experienced. They influence what captures attention, which memories become accessible, how information is interpreted, and what conclusions seem reasonable. Most of this influence occurs quietly. People rarely notice emotions guiding perception because the resulting thoughts often feel natural and self-evident. The emotional contribution remains hidden beneath the surface of awareness. One of the clearest examples involves attention. At any given moment, the environment contains far more information than the brain can process fully. Countless sights, sounds, sensations, and thoughts compete for awareness. Attention acts as a filter. It determines which pieces of information receive priority and which remain in the background. Emotions play an important role in directing that filter. Imagine two people walking through the same city street. One feels relaxed and content. The other feels anxious. Although both occupy the same physical environment, they may notice very different things. The relaxed individual may pay attention to architecture, conversations, or pleasant details in the surroundings. The anxious individual may focus more heavily on uncertainty, potential problems, unusual movements, or signs of danger. Neither person is intentionally choosing these priorities. The emotional state influences attention automatically. The world itself remains unchanged. What changes is which parts of the world receive emphasis. Fear provides one of the most powerful demonstrations of this process. When people become afraid, attention often narrows toward threat-related information. This response makes evolutionary sense. In dangerous situations, rapid identification of potential hazards improves survival. The brain allocates resources accordingly. As a result, fearful individuals may detect threat-related cues more quickly than neutral ones. The effect can be useful when genuine danger exists. However, it can also contribute to distorted perceptions when the threat is imagined, exaggerated, or unlikely. A person who feels anxious may begin noticing evidence that appears to confirm the anxiety. Ambiguous events take on greater significance. Neutral information receives less attention. The emotional state shapes perception in ways that seem objectively true while they are occurring. Sadness influences attention differently. Rather than heightening sensitivity to immediate threats, sadness often shifts focus toward themes of loss, difficulty, and reflection. Certain memories become easier to access. Certain interpretations become more available. The emotional lens changes what feels psychologically relevant. This relationship between emotion and memory is especially fascinating. Many people assume memories are stored independently of current feelings, yet emotional state often influences which memories become most accessible. Psychologists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as mood-congruent memory. When people feel happy, positive memories frequently come to mind more easily. When they feel sad, memories associated with disappointment, regret, or loss may become more accessible. The memories themselves remain stored regardless of mood. What changes is the ease with which they can be retrieved. The brain appears to organize information partly according to emotional themes. Current feelings help determine which portions of memory receive priority. This process can create powerful feedback loops. A sad mood makes sad memories easier to access. Those memories reinforce the mood. The strengthened mood increases access to similar memories. The cycle continues. The same pattern can occur with many emotional states. What makes this especially interesting is that individuals often interpret the resulting memories as objective evidence about reality. A person may conclude that life has always been difficult because difficult memories are currently most accessible. Another person experiencing a positive mood may reach a very different conclusion using equally sincere reasoning. Both individuals are drawing from genuine memories. The difference lies in which memories are most available at that moment. Emotions influence not only what people remember, but also how they reason. Many decisions that appear purely logical contain emotional components. This does not mean reasoning becomes irrational whenever emotion is involved. In fact, emotion often provides valuable information. Feelings help signal priorities, values, goals, and potential concerns. Without emotion, decision-making becomes surprisingly difficult. Neurological studies have shown that individuals with certain forms of emotional impairment may struggle with choices, despite retaining intellectual abilities. The challenge arises because reasoning alone cannot easily determine what matters most. Emotion helps assign significance. The difficulty is that emotions can sometimes bias judgment. For example, fear frequently increases risk sensitivity. Potential dangers appear more prominent. Cautious options become more attractive. Optimistic emotional states often produce the opposite effect. Opportunities receive greater emphasis. Risks may seem less concerning. Neither perspective is entirely right or wrong. Each highlights different aspects of reality. The emotional state influences which aspects feel most important. Anger produces yet another pattern. Research suggests that anger can increase confidence in judgments. People often become more certain of their conclusions when angry. Complex situations may appear simpler. Ambiguity feels less tolerable. The desire for decisive explanations grows stronger. This tendency helps explain why anger can feel so persuasive. The emotion creates a subjective sense of certainty that may exceed the available evidence. Again, the individual rarely notices the emotional contribution. The conclusion simply feels correct. Perhaps one of the most subtle effects of emotion involves interpretation. Human beings constantly interpret ambiguous information. A brief message from a friend, a facial expression from a colleague, a comment made during a conversation. Many situations contain multiple possible meanings. Emotion helps determine which interpretation comes to mind first. Someone feeling secure may view an ambiguous message as harmless. Someone feeling worried may interpret the same message differently. The information remains identical. The meaning changes. This process occurs continuously throughout daily life. Most people assume they are responding to objective reality. In many cases, they are responding to reality filtered through emotional context. This does not imply that emotions are obstacles to truth. On the contrary, emotions provide essential information about human needs, motivations, and relationships. They help prioritize attention and guide behavior in complex environments. The important insight is simply that emotions are not passive reactions. They actively participate in perception and thought. They influence what becomes visible within awareness. They affect which memories emerge from the past. They shape interpretations of the present. They contribute to expectations about the future. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all is how seamlessly these processes operate. The emotional influence usually remains invisible. People experience the resulting perceptions and conclusions directly, rarely noticing the emotional currents beneath them. Yet those currents help shape nearly every aspect of psychological life. And when viewed together, the influence of attention, memory, emotion, prediction, social context, coincidence, fear, and perception, they reveal a broader pattern hidden beneath countless everyday experiences, one that points toward the strange collection of mental quirks that make the human mind so endlessly fascinating.